In this story, I will take you on a heartwarming journey into a snowy winter evening, where a curious twist of fate at a humble Christmas tree lot begins to change two lives forever. So feel free to lay back, close your eyes, and let this soothing tale carry you into the heart of the holiday spirit. The soft hush of winter snow blanketed the small town in silence, broken only by the occasional crunch of boots on icy sidewalks. Tiny golden lights twinkled along the streets, their warm glow reflecting on frost-covered windows. It was the kind of evening where the world felt slower, softer, a perfect moment for stories to unfold. At the edge of town, tucked between rows of bare trees and lampposts wrapped in garlands, stood a modest Christmas tree lot. The air here was heavy with the fresh scent of pine and the faint sweetness of cinnamon drifting from a nearby vendor's cart. Strings of mismatched lights crisscrossed above the rows of evergreens, their gentle flicker dancing against the snow. The scene was simple, yet enchanting, as if pulled from the pages of a holiday postcard. Mary was here every evening, bundled in a patchwork coat and a scarf she'd knitted years ago. She moved among the trees with quiet determination, her gloved hands brushing snow from the branches, her breath puffing into the cold air. This little lot was her world, her livelihood during the winter months. Despite its humble nature, it held a certain magic. Families came here to laugh, to choose the perfect tree, and to carry home a piece of holiday joy. Mary cherished these moments, even when the days grew long and her hands ached from the cold. Tonight, she was not alone. Her son, Ben, darted between the trees, his bright red hat bobbing like a cheerful ornament in the sea of green. At 6 years old, he was full of energy and wonder, his laughter a constant melody against the stillness of the night. He adored the Christmas season and treated the lot like his personal playground, weaving between trunks and dragging a small sled across the snow. As Mary adjusted a hand-painted sign that read, "Fresh cut trees," she glanced toward her son with a soft smile. The boy was her light, her reason to keep going even on the hardest days. Life hadn't been easy, not since losing her husband 3 years ago. He had been a good man, taken far too soon, leaving Mary to build a life for herself and Ben with little more than determination and love. But Mary didn't dwell on those struggles tonight. The tree stood tall and fragrant, customers were happy, and Ben was laughing. For now, that was enough. Far from the cosy glow of the tree lot, high above the bustling city streets, Ethan Carlisle sat in his sleek glass-walled office. The snow outside fell in quiet swirls, but Ethan hardly noticed. His world was deadlines, numbers, and the endless hum of a life built on ambition. To most, Ethan was the picture of success. At 35, he had built a career that others could only dream of. Yet, his life felt hollow, a series of achievements that no longer brought him joy. He stared out at the sprawling city below, its lights shimmering like scattered stars, and wondered when he had stopped caring about the small, simple things. That was when his assistant entered, her tone brisk but polite. "Ethan, there's a charity event this week. A Christmas tree lot fundraiser on the edge of town. The PR team thinks it's a good idea for you to attend. Show some seasonal spirit." Ethan's brow furrowed. "A tree lot? Why would I? It's not optional," she cut in gently. "It's good for your image." Ethan sighed, rubbing his temples. The idea of standing in the snow, feigning holiday cheer, didn't appeal to him, but he nodded. "Fine, 1 hour, no more." The next evening, Ethan's car pulled up to the Christmas tree lot. He stepped out reluctantly, the cold biting at his face. The scene before him was worlds apart from his usual life. Rows of evergreens stretched under the glow of string lights, their dark green branches dusted with snow. Children's laughter filled the air, mingling with the murmur of families choosing their trees. Ethan adjusted his scarf, his polished shoes crunching on the icy ground. He wandered the lot, blending into the crowd with little effort. He He wasn't here to draw attention, just to observe, to fulfill his obligation and leave. But something caught his eye. A young woman was tying a small tree to the roof of a car, her hands moving with practiced ease despite the cold. Her scarf was frayed, her gloves patched, yet she radiated warmth. Ethan lingered near the lot's entrance, watching as she smiled at her family and waved them off. She seemed so at ease in this place, so connected to it. For a man who spent his life in towering offices and sleek boardrooms, the simplicity of it all was strangely captivating. As the evening wore on, Ethan's presence went unnoticed, until a small accident changed everything. His car, idling near the edge of the lot, clipped one of the wooden signs as it reversed. The sign toppled, landing in the snow with a soft thud. Mary turned at the sound, her smile fading. She walked briskly to the scene, her boots crunching over the icy ground. "Careful!" she called, her voice firm but not unkind. Ethan stepped forward, his expression apologetic. "I'll pay for the damage," he said, already reaching for his wallet. Mary shook her head. "It's not just about the money," she said, her tone softening. "That sign was made by my son. We painted it together." Ethan hesitated, feeling uncharacteristically out of place. Before he could respond, a small voice piped up beside her. "Mum, is it broken?" Ethan glanced down to see a boy with bright eyes and a red hat tugging at Mary's coat. She crouched beside him, brushing snow from his cheek. "It's okay, Ben. We'll fix it." Something about the exchange stirred an unfamiliar feeling in Ethan, an ache he couldn't quite place. The moment passed quickly, and he offered a quiet, "Let me help." Mary looked at him, surprised but thoughtful. "You? Fix a sign?" Ethan nodded. "I'll do my best." The tools were simple, a hammer, nails, and a wooden plank. But for Ethan, the task felt monumental. He knelt in the snow, awkwardly driving nails into the wood, his breath clouding in the cold air. Mary watched from a distance, a faint smile tugging at her lips. By the time the sign was repaired, the snow had stopped falling, leaving the lot in a serene stillness. Ethan stood, brushing snow from his coat, and glanced at Mary. She nodded her approval. "Not bad," she said with a giggle. "Thank you." Ethan simply nodded, unsure what to say. But as he turned to leave, he felt a small tug at his sleeve. Ben stood there, his face bright with curiosity. "Do you like Christmas?" Ethan paused, caught off guard. "I don't know," he admitted. Ben tilted his head. "You should try liking it," he said earnestly. "It's nice." For the first time in a long while, Ethan felt the faintest hint of a smile. The next evening, as the snow returned in soft, lazy flurries, Ethan found himself unable to concentrate on his usual routines. His sleek office, with its endless spreadsheets and polished surfaces, felt emptier than usual. Thoughts of the Christmas tree lot, of Mary and her son Ben, kept intruding. He couldn't explain it, but something about their simple world had stayed with him. By the time the clock struck 6, Ethan decided. He put on his heavy coat, wrapped a scarf around his neck, and instructed his driver to take him back to the tree lot. The familiar glow of string lights greeted him as he stepped out of the car. The lot was busier than the night before, with clusters of families laughing and pointing out trees. The air was crisp but alive, filled with the mingling scents of fresh pine and the faint sweetness of nearby baked goods. Ethan's breath billowed in the cold as he hesitated near the entrance, unsure if he was ready to face the warm chaos again. But before he could decide, a small voice called out, "Hey, you came back!" Ethan turned to see Ben, bundled in his bright red hat and mittens, running toward him. The boy's excitement was contagious, his wide grin impossible to ignore. "I told you, Mum, he'd come back," Ben exclaimed, tugging on Ethan's sleeve. Mary appeared a moment later, brushing snow from her gloves as she carried a small bundle of branches. Her expression was one of cautious curiosity. "Back so soon?" she asked, tilting her head slightly. Ethan gave a small shrug. "I thought I'd check if the sign was holding up." Mary smiled faintly, her breath visible in the cold air. "It's holding up just fine, thanks to you." Ben tugged on Ethan's coat again. "You should help us today. We're really busy." Ethan glanced at Mary, unsure. She seemed amused but hesitant. "You don't have to," she said softly, though her tone held a hint of encouragement. Ethan surprised himself by nodding. Why not? For the next hour, Ethan found himself swept into the rhythm of the lot. He carried trees for customers, tied them securely to car roofs, and even helped shake snow from the taller ones. His polished shoes weren't made for the slushy ground, but he didn't seem to mind. The repetitive work was strangely soothing, each task grounding him in a way he hadn't felt in years. Mary worked tirelessly alongside him, her movements quick and efficient. She greeted each customer with a warm smile, offering small holiday wishes as she guided them through the rows of evergreens. Every so often, she'd glance at Ethan, a mixture of amusement and gratitude in her eyes. Ben, of course, was never far away. He followed Ethan like a shadow, offering his own unique advice about which trees were the best ones, and pointing out families who needed help. Ethan couldn't help but smile at the boy's enthusiasm, his laughter brightening the snowy evening. "Do you like working here?" Ben asked, as they secured a particularly large tree to a waiting car. Ethan paused, considering the question. "It's different from what I usually do," he admitted. Ben's eyes lit up. "Different is good, right, Mum?" Mary, overhearing, glanced over with a nod. Sometimes different is exactly what we need. As the evening wore on, the lot grew quieter. Most of the families had gone home, leaving the rows of trees dusted with fresh snow. Ethan stood near the entrance, watching the lights flicker softly in the darkness. The air was still, the kind of stillness that invited reflection. Mary joined him, holding 2 steaming cups of cocoa. She handed one to him without a word, her gloved fingers brushing his for the briefest moment. "Thanks," Ethan said quietly, wrapping his hands around the warm mug. Mary sipped her cocoa, her gaze fixed on the glowing trees. "You did good work today," she said after a moment. "You didn't have to stay, but you did. That means something." Ethan glanced at her, his expression unreadable. "I think I needed it more than you did." Mary looked at him, surprised by the honesty in his voice, but instead of asking questions, she simply smiled and nodded, letting the silence settle between them. Later, as they packed up the lot for the night, Ethan helped Mary tie down a tarp over the unsold trees. Ben had fallen asleep in a nearby chair, his red hat pulled low over his face. The scene felt almost surreal to Ethan, a world so far from the high-rise offices and endless meetings that usually defined his days. "You're good with him," Mary said softly, nodding toward Ben. Ethan hesitated, unsure how to respond. "He's a good kid," he said finally. Mary's smile was warm but tinged with something deeper, a quiet gratitude that Ethan couldn't quite name. "He's my whole world," she said, her voice almost a whisper. For a moment, Ethan said nothing. He looked at Mary, at the snow-dusted lot, at the small boy sleeping peacefully nearby. Something about it all felt right, in a way he hadn't experienced before. Sure. When the lot was finally quiet and dark, Ethan walked Mary and Ben to their small car. Ben stirred as Mary helped him into the back seat, mumbling something about snowball fights before drifting off again. "Thanks for your help tonight," Mary said, leaning against the car door. Her voice was soft, her expression thoughtful. "It's been a long time since I've had someone to share the load." Ethan nodded, his breath visible in the cold air. "I'm glad I could help." Mary hesitated, as if debating whether to say more. Finally, she offered a small smile. "Drive safe, Ethan, and don't be a stranger." Ethan watched as she drove away, the taillights disappearing into the snowy night. He stood there for a moment longer, the soft crunch of snow beneath his feet the only sound. For the first time in years, he felt a quiet sense of peace, a feeling that maybe, just maybe, he had found something worth holding on to. The following days passed like gentle whispers of winter. Snow continued to fall, draping the little Christmas tree lot in a soft, white blanket. Ethan found himself returning again and again, drawn to its warmth, its simplicity, and the quiet joy it seemed to hold. Each visit felt less like an obligation and more like a choice, a small escape from the demands of his other world. Tonight, the lot was quieter than usual. Fewer families wandered through the rows of trees, their voices hushed by the falling snow. Ethan arrived just as the golden lights were flickering on, their glow casting soft shadows on the ground. He adjusted his scarf and stepped through the wooden gate, his breath curling in the cold air. Mary was busy rearranging a display of wreaths. When she noticed him, she offered a soft smile, her eyes reflecting the warm light of the season. "You're becoming a regular," she said gently. Ethan shrugged, his lips curving into the faintest smile. "I guess I am." Ben's cheerful voice rang out from behind a row of trees. "Ethan, you're here!" The boy darted toward him, dragging a small sled through the snow. "Want to help me find the best tree for a family?" Before Ethan could answer, Ben grabbed his hand and began pulling him deeper into the lot. Mary laughed quietly, shaking her head as she watched them disappear among the evergreens. For the next hour, Ethan found himself immersed in the simple tasks of the lot. He worked alongside Mary, handing out candy canes to the few customers who braved the cold and helping tie trees to car roofs. Ben, as always, stayed close, treating Ethan like an honorary member of the family. At one point, the three of them stood near a small bonfire that Mary had lit to keep the evening chill at bay. The flames crackled softly, their warmth a welcome contrast to the biting air. Ben poked at the fire with a long stick, his cheeks flushed pink from the cold. "Do you have a tree at home?" Ben asked suddenly, looking up at Ethan. Ethan hesitated, the question catching him off guard. "Not this year," he admitted. "I don't usually decorate." Ben frowned, his little brow furrowing. "But it's Christmas. You have to have a tree." Mary chuckled softly, shaking her head. "Not everyone celebrates the same way, Ben. Remember?" "But it's more fun with a tree," Ben insisted, his voice earnest. Ethan glanced at the boy, then at Mary, who gave him a knowing look. For a moment, the silence between them was filled only with the sound of the crackling fire. "I'll think about it," Ethan said finally, his voice quiet but sincere. Ben beamed, satisfied with the answer, and went back to poking at the fire. As the evening wore on, the lot grew empty. Mary began tidying up the small cabin where she kept her receipts and extra decorations, while Ethan helped Ben stack the last of the unsold trees near the back fence. The boy chattered happily as they worked, his energy seemingly endless despite the long day. "You're good at this," Ben said, watching as Ethan tied the last bundle of branches. Ethan smirked, shaking his head. "I think you've got higher standards than I do." Ben laughed, then looked at him thoughtfully. "Are you going to stay for dinner again? Mum makes the best soup." Ethan hesitated, glancing toward the cabin where Mary was still busy. The thought of returning to his cold, quiet apartment felt uninviting. "I don't want to intrude," he said, his tone careful. "You wouldn't," Ben said with a confident nod. "Mum likes having you around, I can tell." The boy's words lingered in Ethan's mind as they finished stacking the trees. By the time they returned to the cabin, Mary had already set a small table with bowls and a loaf of fresh bread. She looked up as they entered, her expression soft. "You're welcome to join us," she said simply. Ethan nodded, a quiet gratitude in his eyes. "Thank you." Dinner was simple but comforting. A warm bowl of soup, slices of bread, and a plate of cookies that Ben had helped bake earlier in the week. The three of them sat at the small table, their conversation easy and unhurried. Mary spoke about the lot, about the families who came each year, and the little traditions they carried with them. Her voice was calm and steady, a soothing rhythm that filled the quiet kitchen. Ethan listened more than he spoke, drawn to the warmth of her presence. At one point, Ben shared a story about a snowball fight he'd won earlier that week, his words tumbling out in an excited rush. Mary laughed, her eyes crinkling at the corners, and Ethan found himself smiling without realizing it. For the first time in years, he felt present. The usual weight of his world, deadlines, expectations, and endless distractions had faded into the background. Here, in this little house, with its modest Christmas tree and the faint scent of pine, he felt something he hadn't known he was missing. After dinner, Ben fell asleep on the couch, his red hat still perched on his head. Ethan helped Mary clean up, their movements quiet and companionable. The kitchen was filled with the soft clink of dishes and the faint hum of a Christmas song playing on the radio. "You're good with him," Mary said after a while, her voice breaking the comfortable silence. Ethan glanced at her, surprised. "Ben's easy to like," he replied. Mary smiled, her gaze drifting toward the sleeping boy. "He's had to grow up fast," she said softly. "Losing his dad so young, it hasn't been easy." Ethan hesitated, sensing the weight of her words. "You've done a good job," he said finally. "He's a great kid." Mary looked at him then, her eyes warm but thoughtful. "Thank you," she said quietly. "That means a lot." For a moment, the two of them stood there, the silence between them filled with unspoken understanding. Outside, the snow fell softly, the world wrapped in a peaceful stillness. When it was time for Ethan to leave, Mary walked him to the door. The night was calm, the air crisp and clear. She paused for a moment, her hand resting on the edge of the doorframe. "You're welcome here anytime," she said gently, her words carrying a quiet sincerity. Ethan nodded, his breath visible in the cold air. "Good night, Mary." As he stepped into the snow and walked toward his car, Ethan glanced back once more. Mary stood in the doorway, her silhouette framed by the warm light of the house. For the first time in a long while, Ethan felt a quiet sense of belonging, a feeling he wasn't sure he deserved, but couldn't ignore. The days drifted by like snowflakes falling softly from the sky. Ethan became a quiet but constant presence at the Christmas tree lot, arriving in the evenings to help Mary and Ben with their work. It felt natural now, this simple rhythm of stacking trees, greeting customers, and sharing quiet dinners. Each visit seemed to soften something inside him, a part of himself he hadn't realized had grown so distant. On one such evening, the lot was quiet, with only a few customers browsing the neatly arranged rows of evergreens. The golden string lights swayed gently in the wind, their glow casting long, peaceful shadows over the snow-dusted ground. Ethan was tying a tree to a car roof when Mary approached him, her arms full of wreaths. "Thanks for staying late," she said with a soft smile. "I know you probably have more exciting places to be." Ethan shook his head. "Not really." Mary raised an eyebrow, her expression playful. "No holiday parties? No big meetings in the city?" Ethan hesitated, then gave a faint smile. "This is better." Her smile lingered, her gaze warm but thoughtful. "Well, we're glad to have you." Ben's laughter rang out nearby as he slid across the icy lot with his little sled. Ethan watched him for a moment, his chest tightening with a feeling he couldn't quite name. "You've built something special here," he said after a while, his voice quieter now. Mary glanced at him, surprised by the sincerity in his tone. "It's not much, but it's ours," she said simply. "It's more than most people have," Ethan replied. For a moment, they stood in silence, their breath visible in the cold air. The world around them seemed to hold its breath, the snow falling gently like a whispered promise. Later that evening, after the last customer had left, Mary invited Ethan inside for dinner. It had become a familiar routine now, sharing a simple meal, warming up by the fire, and listening to Ben's endless chatter about his day. Tonight, however, the atmosphere felt different. There was a quiet tension beneath the surface, a sense that something unspoken lingered between them. Mary seemed preoccupied, her gaze drifting toward the window more often than usual. After dinner, when Ben had fallen asleep on the couch, Ethan helped Mary clear the table. The quiet clink of dishes and the faint hum of the radio filled the room, but the silence between them felt heavier than usual. "Is something on your mind?" Ethan asked gently, glancing at her as he dried a plate. Mary hesitated, her hands stilling over the dish she was washing. She seemed to weigh her words carefully before speaking. "It's just, sometimes I wonder if I'm doing enough," she said finally. "For Ben, for the lot, for everything." Ethan frowned, setting the plate down. "You're doing more than enough," he said firmly. "Ben's happy, he's safe. And this place, what you've built here, it means something. To him, to this community." Mary looked at him, her expression soft but uncertain. "It's hard to see it that way sometimes," she admitted. Ethan stepped closer, his voice steady. "You've created something real, Mary. That's more than most people can say." Her gaze met his, and for a moment, the air between them felt charged with an unspoken connection. But before either of them could say more, Ben stirred on the couch, mumbling something in his sleep. Mary smiled faintly, breaking the moment. "I should put him to bed," she said softly. Ethan nodded, stepping back. "Of course." As Mary carried Ben to his room, Ethan wandered to the small living room. His gaze fell on the modest Christmas tree in the corner, its paper ornaments swaying gently in the draft. He noticed a few photographs tucked among the branches, pictures of Mary, Ben, and a man he assumed was her late husband. The sight stirred something in him, a quiet longing he didn't fully understand. He thought about the life Mary had built, the strength it must have taken to keep going after losing so much. It was humbling in a way he hadn't expected. When Mary returned, she found Ethan standing by the tree, his hands in his pockets. She joined him quietly, her gaze following his. "That was Michael," she said softly, nodding toward one of the photographs. Ethan glanced at her, his expression gentle. "Your husband?" She nodded, her voice quiet. "He passed away a few weeks after we got married. It was sudden, an accident. Ben was just a baby." Ethan felt a pang of sadness for her, for the life she must have imagined, and the one she had been left with instead. "I'm sorry," he said, his voice low. Mary offered a faint smile, though her eyes glistened with unshed tears. "It's been hard, but we've made it through. Ben gives me a reason to keep going." Ethan hesitated, then said softly, "He's lucky to have you." She looked at him then, her gaze steady, but filled with something he couldn't quite name. "And what about you, Ethan?" she asked quietly. "What keeps you going?" For a moment, Ethan didn't know how to answer. He thought about his life, the endless meetings, the towering offices, the wealth that had never brought him the peace he sought. "I'm not sure," he admitted finally. "Maybe that's why I keep coming here." Mary's expression softened, a quiet understanding passing between them. "Well," she said after a moment, "you're always welcome." Ethan nodded, his chest tightening with a feeling he couldn't quite place. "Thank you," he said quietly. When it was time to leave, Ethan lingered at the door, his hand resting on the knob. The snow had stopped, leaving the world outside wrapped in a soft, glowing stillness. "Good night, Mary," he said, his voice low. "Good night, Ethan," she replied, her tone gentle. As he stepped into the snow, Ethan glanced back once more. Mary stood in the doorway, her silhouette framed by the warm light of the house. For the first time, he felt a quiet sense of clarity, a feeling that perhaps he had found something worth holding on to. The days before Christmas arrived, with a quiet sense of anticipation. Snow blanketed the small town, softening every edge and muffling every sound. The tree lot had grown busier, with families hurrying to find their perfect tree before the holiday. Ethan was there most evenings now, helping Mary and Ben without hesitation. It had become more than a routine. It was a part of him, as natural as the falling snow. On Christmas Eve, the air was crisp and still, the world holding its breath in quiet wonder. The golden lights of the tree lot flickered gently in the darkness as the last of the customers made their way home. Mary closed the gate behind them, her breath curling in the cold air. Ethan stayed to help pack up, stacking the last of the unsold trees and tidying the rows of wreaths. Ben was inside the small cabin, dozing in a chair with a blanket wrapped tightly around him. The night felt peaceful, a rare kind of stillness that seemed to hold its own magic. Mary joined Ethan by the bonfire they'd built near the edge of the lot. The flames crackled softly, their warmth a welcome contrast to the chill in the air. She held 2 mugs of cocoa, offering one to him as she sat down on an overturned log. "Thank you for everything," she said softly, her voice almost lost in the crackle of the fire. "You didn't have to be here all these nights, but I'm glad you were." Ethan took the mug, the warmth seeping into his hands. He looked at her, his gaze steady. "I think I needed this more than you did," he said quietly. Mary smiled, her eyes glistening in the firelight. "Why's that?" Ethan hesitated, choosing his words carefully. "I didn't realize how empty my life had become. Everything was about work, about success. But here, with you and Ben, it's different. It feels real." Her expression softened, and she looked down at her cocoa. "Sometimes I think the simplest things are the most important," she said. "Family, kindness, just being there for each other." Ethan nodded, his chest tightening at the truth in her words. For a moment, neither of them spoke, the silence between them filled with the soft crackle of the fire and the distant hum of the town's church bells. When the fire burned low, Mary stood and brushed the snow from her coat. "I should get Ben home," she said, her voice gentle. "It's late." Ethan nodded, standing as well. "I'll help you pack up." Together they carried the last of the decorations to the small cabin and secured the tarp over the remaining trees. Ben stirred as they entered, rubbing his eyes sleepily. "Is it Christmas yet?" he mumbled. "Almost," Mary said with a smile, wrapping his scarf around his neck. "Let's get you home, sweetheart." As Mary bundled Ben into the car, Ethan lingered by the gate, his hands in his pockets. The snow had stopped, leaving the world wrapped in a soft, glowing stillness. When Mary finished, she walked back to him, her footsteps crunching softly in the snow. "Ethan," she began, her voice quiet but steady. "I don't know what brought you here that first night, but I'm glad it did." Ethan met her gaze, his heart heavy with unspoken words. "Me too," he said softly. For a moment, they stood there, the silence between them filled with the weight of everything they wanted to say. Then Mary smiled, a quiet, hopeful smile that seemed to carry its own kind of promise. "Good night, Ethan," she said gently, "Good night, Mary," he replied. As she drove away, her taillights disappearing into the snowy night, Ethan stood alone by the gate. But he didn't feel alone. For the first time in years, he felt connected to Mary, to Ben, to a part of himself he thought he'd lost. On Christmas morning, the town was quiet, its streets dusted with fresh snow. The little house at the edge of the tree lot was filled with the scent of cinnamon and pine, its modest decorations glowing softly in the morning light. Ben tore open a small pile of presents, his laughter filling the cozy space. Mary watched him from the kitchen, her heart full as she sipped her coffee. She had never been one for grand holidays, but this year felt different, lighter, brighter. There was a knock at the door. Mary set her mug down, her brow furrowing as she walked to answer it. When she opened the door, Ethan stood on the porch, holding a small bundle wrapped in brown paper. "Merry Christmas," he said, his breath curling in the cold air. Mary blinked, surprised but smiling. "Merry Christmas, Ethan. What are you doing here?" "I wanted to bring this by," he said, handing her the bundle. "For Ben, and for you." She unwrapped it carefully, revealing a small wooden ornament in the shape of a tree. It was simple but beautifully made, with the word family etched into its surface. Mary's breath caught as she ran her fingers over the letters. "It's beautiful," she said softly. "Thank you." Ethan hesitated, his gaze steady. "I meant what I said last night, Mary. Being here with you and Ben, it's shown me what I've been missing, and I want to be a part of it, if you'll let me." Mary looked at him, her eyes shimmering with unshed tears. For a long moment, she said nothing, her emotions too tangled to speak. But then she smiled, a quiet, hopeful smile that seemed to hold everything she felt. "You already are," she said gently. Later that morning, as the snow fell softly outside, Ethan sat by the fire with Mary and Ben, the little wooden ornament hanging proudly on their tree, the warmth of the room, the sound of Ben's laughter, and the quiet presence of the woman beside him felt more meaningful than anything he'd ever known. For the first time in years, Ethan Carlyle understood what it meant to truly belong. And as the fire crackled softly and the world outside grew still, he knew that this simple, quiet moment was the greatest gift he could have ever received. Ethan learned that redemption isn't about fixing everything, it's about doing better every day. And Mary discovered that sometimes even the coldest hearts can change. If you enjoyed this story of love, redemption, and hope, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more heartwarming tales. See you in the next story, and happy holidays.